So welcome. So I do believe that we are now live. So and the first session is actually a panel discussion, and it will focus on modernization and digitalization of clinical trials. So goes without saying, I'm very excited for everyone to be here today. Hope you find it an interesting discussion. I've had conversations with a number of the panelists and speakers throughout the event, and I believe there'll be some very, very exciting insights shared. So I'd like to introduce very briefly the following panelists. So we have Luis Garcia Gancedo, who is Director Digital Biomarkers for GSK. Bert Hartog, R&D Operations, Senior Director, Janssen Clinical Innovation for Johnson & Johnson. And Zume Kai, Head of Clinical Research, Digital Medicine and Translational Imaging for Pfizer. And finally, your moderator, Jeremy Wyatt, who is Chief Executive Officer for Actigraph. But before we start, I'd just like to just take a minute just to remind attendees, you've joined in listen-only mode, so you are muted. There are various areas within the system that I would encourage you to use. Again, I mentioned this in the opening, but just as a reminder, there is a Q&A functionality which sits on your right-hand side of the screen. I would encourage you to ask questions throughout. Just drop the notes in there. And towards the end of the session, Jeremy will select those questions. We'll ask them to the panelists. We have a poll as well. So on the right-hand side, it's cleverly titled polls. So it's easy to find. Just click on there, fill that out. It'll be really useful information. Jeremy and I will be reviewing that throughout as well, so that we can try and integrate that into the session. So that's it from me, really. Don't want to get in the way of juicy information, so I will hand over to Jeremy Wyatt. Once again, Chief Executive Officer for Actigraph. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that, and appreciate everyone joining today and being a part of this. I'm really honored to be just a part of this really esteemed panel. I've got so much respect for this team. I work with them all in various capacities in the efforts that we're talking about today. And honestly, I was just sharing with them before we went live here that I have so much respect for them and appreciate everything that they do for the industry. So with that said, what I'd like to do is just give a little framework here of what we're going to talk about, let the panelists introduce themselves, and then get into some questions. But really, this will be more of a conversation. To that end, we do have some handouts over on the right that we as a group have sort of hand-selected as tools that we thought might be helpful to augment our conversation today. I do have the polls on the right, and interestingly enough, I'm used to Zoom, so I usually have to click launch to do that, but I think these are just all live at the same time. So if you would, please just take a moment while we're talking and go through and answer those questions. That'll give us some guidance really on, how to drive the conversation today. So that'd be helpful for us. So the topic we're talking about today is obviously IoT and clinical trials. That's the name of this virtual summit. And, I think for me, I'm excited about that because Actigraph does a lot of IoT and digital trials. And it's really, every study we do is different. Every engagement that we have is unique. And what I appreciate about the panelists today is they all have a perspective on that in this rapidly evolving industry and this rapidly evolving topic. Which really changes a lot based on what's happening in the environment with us today, especially given COVID and especially given just the changes that we've seen and the momentum behind, the regulatory support for digital measures in clinical studies. And so with that said, let me just stop for a second and allow the panelists to introduce themselves and give just a brief background. What we'll do is go through that. I'll ask some questions and we'll have a conversation. And then I'd like to spend the last 20 minutes or so, if we have it, just taking questions and having a discussion with the audience. I think that'd be a fruitful time to spend. So Bert, I'll start with you. If you could just introduce the panelists and then pass to Jaime and then to Luis.
Sure. Thank you, Jeremy. And likewise, very happy to be here. This is a topic that is close to my heart. It's one I care about a lot for two reasons. One, because it helps us do our research better, but second, and probably even more important, it helps us to connect with patients better. with these IoT solutions, we can really get to what matters most for patients. And that is a fascinating domain to explore and see what solutions are sufficiently stable to use in the setting where we do our business. My background is in clinical development. I've spent my entire career in different roles in clinical development. Today with Janssen in clinical innovation, looking for alternative ways to do clinical research, alternative to the traditional way, which is in a hospital with an investigator. Patient goes to see the investigator in clinic. That's where the research happens. Alternatives include DCT, that everybody is now so familiar with. There's many more alternatives. My background is based on experience in the science of clinical research, life sciences, in technology, in project management, in quality assurance, in clinical operations. I've been in different roles covering different facets of this clinical development as we know it today, which is quite helpful looking at the current requirements, the requirements of my current role, where I own the digital health portfolio in our clinical innovation team. And what that means is really two questions that need answering. One is, how can we use these technologies for efficiency gain in clinical research? How can we make clinical research more efficient by doing remote monitoring, remote measurement, and related? And as a spin-off, how can we make research more attractive? Typically because of remote monitoring, where people don't have to go to clinic. So there's a little bit more to it than just efficiency. And the second question is, how can we enable new science in clinical research with these technologies? How can we measure, quantify objectively what cannot be measured otherwise? Or how can we replace subjective with objective? Or how can we complement experience with functioning? So the new science that is enabled by these technologies makes it ever so much more fascinating. And that brings a lot of questions about ethics, about privacy, about security, you name it. So we typically work through all that to see what solutions we can bring to scale for easy deployment in clinical trials. So that's a bit of a lengthy description, but it might explain why I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah. Thanks, Bert. Shamay, can you give us a background on you?
Yes, absolutely. So I guess my my route into industry has been maybe not as traditional as some. I don't think I would have, if you'd asked me if I would be here 7 years ago, I probably wouldn't have imagined that this is where I would be working. My background is actually in neurology and critical care medicine. So I'm a neurointensivist, and actually I still do practice and see patients in the clinical setting. And I had, experience as an investigator, and as a site in a lot of the clinical trials that we ran, throughout my training in residency and in fellowship. And this opportunity to work at Pfizer came along about 6 years ago. And what really appealed to me was the idea of coming to different, more quantitative endpoints for clinical trials, especially in the background where I was seeing patients in neuroscience. There's a lot of very subjective clinical rating scales, as Bert just mentioned, a lot of visits. And for some of our patients, that is not necessarily the easiest when you have, functional limitations and difficulties transporting, or if you don't live in a large city with access to research and academic medical centers. So the idea of being able to, make research more inclusive, to bring it to different populations, to be able to do some of the same clinical work that I do kind of with continuous physiological monitoring that I see in the ICU, to be able to take that kind of data and be able to bring it to the home where we could better monitor people where they are living, rather than just asking them recall questions about how they've been doing episodically. That part really appealed to me in terms of, let's see, where this technology takes us, because I think it really is going to revolutionize clinical trials. And just in the last, 6 years since I've been working in this space, I've seen the evolution and transformation, standardization, and people coming together in forums such as this and others, really looking to bring this community together and bring, rigor and scientific method behind it. So I'm very pleased to be here with all of this.
Shami, I have to think that your background on the investigator and site side and being with patients often as you are is really probably colored a lot of your perspective. I'm eager to hear from you today on some of that. Luis, can you give us an intro?
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. So first of all, hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for joining us today. So my name is Luis Garcia-Gancido. I currently head up the digital biomarkers team at GSK, which in essence is a team that supports all our clinical development programs to incorporate novel digital technologies across our development programs. So we support all therapeutic areas. We do work across respiratory conditions, neurosciences, immunology, oncology, and many others. And we support as well all sort of development phases, including very early, as well as epidemiology and others. My own background is in engineering and physical sciences. I specialize particularly in medical devices. Prior to my current role, I've had a variety of roles within GSK around different types of digital innovations, both in the clinical space as well as the preclinical space. In my life before GSK, I was an academic, so I spent a number of years in academia doing sort of research and having a lectureship as well, so teaching undergraduate and postgraduate students. And the sort of opportunity to move into GSK came in 2014. So I've been with GSK for about 7 years now. So one of the main things that attracted me to GSK is that sort of opportunity to have a very direct impact into sort of patients' life. The work in academia for me was super exciting from a technical point of view and from an innovation point of view, but I felt that at GSK I had the opportunity to have a real impact on patients, which was something very important to me. I live in Cambridge in the UK, and as I said, I've been with GSK for about 7 years, and that's in a nutshell.
Thanks, Luis. That's a great overview. And a common theme that I hear across the panel is really patience, right? I mean, we tend to forget when we start talking about technology that we're not doing that because it's cool. We're not doing that because it's a new way to do this. We're ultimately doing it for the sake of the patients. And even when we start talking about, everybody can quote, Ken Getz Tufts research. We talk about trying to improve efficiency and reduce cost, but ultimately that the result of that is getting therapies to patients quicker and faster and in a way that they are the center of the overall thing. And I'm giving a short talk after this that talks a bit about that. But to just cover the topic, when we say IoT and clinical trials, what are we talking about exactly there? And so I took a moment just to write down what my opinion was or what I believe that was. And so I'm going to read it here because that's easy to do. But I just wrote down internet-connected technologies that provide semi-continuous measurements of patient response and behavior, like daytime activities, sleep, functional specific measures that they do in home, to augment or supplant in-clinic measures. And so, when we talk about IoT, it covers a lot of different, facets, and it certainly, is technology heavy. Does anybody disagree with that definition, or are we all on the same page?
Well, it's hard to disagree, right? I would, however, suggest an additional piece, and that is that since we've seen PROs and biomarkers introduced in clinical research, it became clear that there's a gap in our measurement solution around functioning in a real-world setting, and that's where IoT comes in. And you really want that. What used to be a triangle with your clinical measure, your biomarker, your PRO, you want that to become a square with the fourth corner covering functional measurement in a real-world setting. You can argue you can do functional measurement in a clinic setting, but I would argue that's the kind of bias you can do without. In a real-world setting where IoT comes in, it is a real nice supplement to the other three, where you can get a more holistic view on a patient response to treatment or patients living with disease with these four different components all measured in an equally robust manner.
Bert, you mentioned four, and I got biomarker, PRO. What were the other two?
Clinical, so doctor's impression, doctor's measurement, clinician measurement, and functional.
Functional, yeah, okay. That's the one we just talked about. Okay, good. That's good input. I just wrote that down. I learned something today. So, Lewis, let me go back to you. What problems are we able to solve, by leveraging IoT and clinical trials? In your opinion, who stands to benefit, and what challenges are we overcoming with it?
Thanks, Jeremy. So I think there are many problems that we can potentially solve, and I can describe what I think are maybe three of the main benefits of using sort of wearables, digital technologies, digital biomarkers in our clinical trials. I think the first one is potentially a better assessment of efficacy. The second one is an opportunity to optimize safety. And the third one is around patient stratification. Now, what I can do is, know these are sort of very broad, so let me unpack these three sort of briefly. But please keep in mind that I personally don't think that these opportunities and the potential benefits are sort of equal across different disease areas, because each disease area has its own unique challenges, which digital tools may or may not sort of help us address. So the first opportunity or the first benefit that I mentioned is around efficacy assessments. And I know efficacy, again, is a very broad term. So I'll be a little bit more tangible. First of all, digital tools, which is something Bart just mentioned, allow us to measure objectively how patients function in their real world and everyday life. And that information is potentially very valuable to complement patient-reported outcomes. So through a patient-reported outcomes, typically what we get is how patients feel. What we can get through a digital measure is how patients function in particular areas that patients, prescribers, and payers care about. So if you think about pain, if you think about fatigue, if you think about mobility, if you think about the ability of the patients to perform activities of daily living, these are concepts that we typically capture through patient-reported outcomes. The information is very useful, but can really benefit from a complementary measure to give us a true understanding of what is the real impact of diseases and a real impact of our therapeutic interventions in patients' daily life. And patients, again, prescribers and payers are increasingly asking us for these type of evidence. The other element or the other opportunity around efficacy, I think, is as well enabling us to collect information and collect data that may allow us to make a better decision whether we should progress an asset from a phase 1 to a phase 2, for example. And again, I think this is particularly useful in diseases, for example, in neurosciences. So if we think about the challenges around Parkinson's disease, ALS, Alzheimer's disease, the challenges in our clinical studies is sometimes it is very difficult with the traditional or with the standard clinical measures to evaluate disease progression within the timelines that we've got for our clinical studies. And the result for that is, of course, we need to have very long clinical studies that recruit many patients to be able to get statistically significant differences between the different treatment arms. So digital measures potentially allow us to be more sensitive to disease progression and allow us to make better decisions whether we progress the assets or not. The second element that I did mention is around safety. And I think there are, again, several things here. Digital tools potentially allow us to translate some of the safety measures that we typically collect at the clinical site and allow us to translate that to patients' home, thereby enabling decentralized clinical trials. But also by means of being able to monitor patients more frequently, in many cases, we can collect additional information that is not available through the infrequent examination that we typically do at the clinical sites. So I think that is an important area of opportunity, I think. And the third thing that I did mention is around patient stratification. I think it's important to realize that much of the information that we collect using these new technologies is not available through any other way that we have to examine the patients. And for that reason, we can use these data to potentially identify patient subpopulations that may benefit more from the treatments that we give them. Perhaps not independently, perhaps as an input, to a broader patient stratification model.
Yeah.
So I think these are the three key things I want to highlight.
That's great, Lewis. So, Shami, let me come to you a second. Going back to Lewis's kind of first point there around efficacy, and he talked specifically and gave an example of neurological disorders and where he sees benefit there. Can you maybe comment on that and talk a little bit about your perspective around, it's no secret that, there's a perspective that there's a bit of crudeness around the assays that are available in neuroscience for measuring disease progression and getting comfortable with phase 2 to phase 3 movements. Do you see the benefit there, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. I think neuroscience is one of those big areas, partly because there's not a lot of great surrogate biomarkers out there. We can't draw blood from a patient's arm to measure something in the brain, except in the very rare instances where you're looking at like a hormonal signal that might be secreted centrally. But outside of that example, there's almost nothing that you can really look at easily in terms of other disease areas where, a patient can go get a blood draw, or they can go get a finger stick or something that kind of gives you a little quantitative, easy to measure endpoint. That doesn't really exist very nicely in the neurosciences. There's a lot of work going on with imaging. But at the end of the day, a lot of these diseases are still made kind of on a clinical diagnosis scale. I think Luis just mentioned Parkinson's disease. That diagnosis is still very much made clinically in terms of all the signs and symptoms and constellation of symptoms. But in terms of what we use currently to measure that in the clinic, like the UPDRS, it's kind of just something that's been used for a very, very long time. Was thought of systematically, but of how could a clinician who's sitting in an office evaluate a patient who's coming in and seeing them. And to be honest, outside of the clinical trial space, it's not always used that routinely in clinical practice because it takes such a long time to administer that you're not necessarily going to be following that patient and doing that rating scale every time you see them in clinic, unless they're part of a clinical trial. And so that's an interesting part of where, it's not necessarily, the two of them don't necessarily go hand in hand. Yeah. And as we was saying, we do ask patients how they're feeling. And some of them actually really go home and they quantify their physical function for you. I've had patients who go and do their own sit-to-stand tests, who go on the treadmill and will report values to you because they want to quantify that. They want to see, especially as you're starting medications, doing dose titrations, they want to see how that is actually impacting their life. So we have actually a lot of patients who've been doing this, even, years before these kind of connected technologies came into existence. They were trying to figure out in their own home, what can I do repeatedly that can show me how this drug is working for me? And so we've kind of taken that concept and said, okay, well, why don't we come up with some technologies then that can actually measure that, not just for the patient or for that individual patient, but so that they can, transfer that to their clinician and also be able to use that information in a clinical trial.
Yeah. So I'll just pause for a second before we get into some other questions here. It's a great discussion. And maybe just for the sake of the audience, I'm looking at some of the polls, and there's a few in here that's sort of on the side of no idea where to start, with regards to implementing IoT and some of these emerging, clinical studies that we've got coming up. And so maybe just for the audience here, I just want to say, maybe just a little bit about, can we just get pragmatic for a second? What are we actually talking about? Make sure we're not getting too far away from the topic here. So at Actigraph, we've been doing this a long time, 20 years. We've been in this space with creating medical grade wearable devices that were historically used in academic research around the world. So our products have been used in a lot of different studies globally. And there's a lot that we've learned through the academic world. And then as we moved into clinical trials, we learned quickly that if you're talking to someone at a clinical site and you're trying to explain the depth of the technology, right, it's quickly over their head. And so, there's an important bridge here between using technology and implementing the technology. And so just my experience of how this actually works. So in a typical study, we'll deploy a wearable device, and that wearable device is able to measure really one of two different things, right? It's able to measure sort of globally and in general, how mobile is the patient. how active are they? How much are they out and about and moving around? We do that with accelerometry, so the measure of movement, and we also do that with gyroscope, the measure of rotation and turn, and et cetera. So that gives us insights into how patients use their hands. And then a little deeper, we're also able to get into some maybe functional specific things. So, hey, what Jaime mentioned a second ago about some of these sit-to-stand tests that patients are doing, and even 6-minute walk tests, we see a trend there of the ability for us to sort of as part of the trial say at this point in time during the day, we'd like you to do this functional test that we would actually ask you to do in the clinic. And we're going to measure that, and we're going to mark it by having you do some activity on your phone or with the wearable pressing a button. And so I just want to clarify, we're talking about these technologies. We're talking about the overall monitoring of mobility and sleep even. How effectively are we sleeping? These are sort of long-term, assessments, but we're also talking about functional specific assessments that we think we can do a pretty good job of in the home. And so I just, maybe that's a little obvious, but just to say, what is this? What are we talking about? What does it look like? Our tools and other tools also are enabled through cellular connections, whether it's through pairing with mobile devices that have been sent home of the patient. In our case, we also have a cellular appliance, a little hub that goes home, and it's very passive. It just collects data passively. And so there's a lot of things in the world of Internet of Things, right, that are involved in getting that data and getting it effectively. So with that said, Bert, talk to me a little bit about, you've been doing this a long time. What are the challenges of kind of not just making that happen operationally, but also just in getting to those different things that we need to measure? What have you run into that we're a lot of these folks that are on the line today, hey, maybe I've already bumped my head into this wall. Let me tell you what you're going to run into, and maybe my thoughts on what we're doing, on our side, J&J there, to help with that.
Yeah, very happy to. And thank you, Jeremy, for keeping us grounded on what we're talking about here. That's important. So let me start by sharing a little anecdote that was somewhat funny but somewhat sad at the same time. In one clinical trial where we wanted to measure patients' mobility, we felt that perhaps to get as much control as needed, let's provision devices to these patients, these participants. Let's send them a phone, let's send them the technology they need so we can get some standardization, some consistency. And when we explained to the participants that this is the technology for the study, here's how to use it, there was education and training and all the rest of it. And we said, and this is the phone number to call when the technology breaks, and then we'll replace it. And that was a big mistake, because we've never seen so much technology disappear from existence and people asking for replacement, because they found this was a nice little gimmick where they could get free replacement technology through the trial mechanism. So big mistake there. We learned quickly, so we could contain it. And of course, this technology that we provided for free ended up somewhere other than the study participant. However, that was distributed. I think two aspects of implementation challenges I would like to mention. One is this logistics phenomenon. To get the technology to the patient, to get the technology from the country where it's made to the country where it's used, all of these logistics are not to be taken for granted. It's not as easy as FedExing a piece of kit to somebody somewhere in the world. There are actually specific regulations. You're not allowed to send technology from some countries to other countries. There are batteries involved that you cannot send in bulk because of some legislation around fire hazard. There's a ton of things that come with logistics, and in our experience, you need a partner. As a sponsor company, you need a partner who can help you with these logistics, because that's a specialty area where some people made it their core business, and that is a service you should really think about acquiring. The other aspect is that a clinician, an investigator, a study coordinator, a study nurse, anyone on the clinical team, they were not trained to be technology support providers. That's not what they know a heck of a lot about. That's not what they like doing. That's not why they go to work in the morning. So we have to be very careful when a study participant runs into troubles with the technology. typically they call the nurse, they call the investigator. And that's the last phone call they want to receive because they don't know how to answer, let alone may never have the time. So that dependency on a support mechanism should not become a burden on the site, because then the site will never want to do business with you again. That's not what they're in business for. Sites care about the healthcare, the research, not so much the tech support. So tech support is absolutely critical. The best technology with the wrong user still requires support. So thinking about a support mechanism that's scalable, affordable, accessible, and please don't make the mistake of offering a 1-800 number to people participating from China, because they may not speak English. So think about the patient experience and think about setting up a support mechanism that really is tailored to the needs of the study participants, and then you can save yourself a lot of troubles.
Yeah, thanks for those kind of operational challenges, Bert. I mean, it's not true. I think we just sort of take that for granted, like that piece will work itself out, but it requires some intentional thinking about that. Lewis, on your side, what endpoints do I choose? How do I know the right thing to ask the vendor, maybe, or what do I start with the technology? Hey, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I'm going to try to figure it out how to get in the trial. Or do I start with the patient and what they need? Tell me a little bit about how you choose that.
So I think that's a very good question. I'll say never start with the technology first. So I think we need to run away from a technology push and rather work on a clinical pool. So I think from my point of view, the starting point is always identifying what is the challenge. What is the challenge that we want to solve? And there is an underlying question as to whether a digital technology may help us address that challenge or not. It may very well be that it doesn't. So I think if we identify that a digital tool may help us address that challenge, then what we need to ask ourselves is, well, what is the clinical hypothesis? What is it that we are trying to demonstrate? What is the evidence that we need to generate to support our clinical development programs? And that allows us to identify a subgroup of technologies that may be useful. I think, of course, still enabling the technology in the clinical study may be difficult, and then we need to get inputs from lots of people around. First of all, from patients. I'll always advise against introducing any technology in clinical trials without having patient feedback first. Organize a patient panel. Talk to the patients, talk to physicians as well, talk to the key opinion leaders as well. Try to get as much feedback as you can before you deploy the technology, because if it is a technology that patients will not be happy to use, then of course the outcomes are not going to be positive in any way. Talk with your clinical operations people, with your regulatory colleagues, with all the different stakeholders. They need to come together to provide that support to make sure that we are able to sort of crystallize the value that these technologies have to offer. Mm-hmm. So that's the way that I would typically approach it. But every study is different, and you need to keep an open mind to make sure that you adapt to the needs of your study and your patients.
Thanks, Lewis. And so with that said, I want to point to a tool here that I think might be helpful for the group that's listening today. And before I do, let me just, Shamay, I'm going to come to you about BYOD in a second and your thoughts on that. So just to prepare your kind of next thing there, but I'll share my screen here because they wouldn't allow me to, I couldn't upload it because it was not a PDF, but this is a great tool. This is the MCT Interactive Selection Tool from Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative. And this tool is very helpful in really trying to discern, like what's the right endpoint that I'm trying to pick here. To Lewis's point, you don't start with the technology. First question here is, patients identified this novel endpoint is important to them. And so, Bert, I mean, you've got experience with this tool, and you and I were talking the other day about some mistakes that we've recently seen in the news where other groups did not start with this. Talk a little bit about your observations and why this tool is important.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. And this is the probably the single most important piece of information today, where to Louis' point, it all starts with the patient. What is the disease patients suffer from? that is typically not where the debate is taking place, but that's where it starts, because with the disease comes a meaningful aspect of health that is something patients care about, something debilitating patients from living their life as they would like to, something that comes with the disease. That meaningful aspect of health needs to be very clearly defined to get to a concept of interest related to that meaningful aspect of health you want to measure. So, for example, a patient suffering from some chronic disease, the meaningful aspect of health may be sleep quality. Patients may complain about their sleep not being as good as it used to be before disease, and therefore they cannot live their life as they want to. So the meaningful aspect of health may be sleep quality. And then the concept of interest may be hours of sleep, or maybe more sophisticated, maybe hours of a REM sleep or non-REM sleep, different sleep stages. And with that understood, you can start looking for, so how do I want to measure that concept of interest? Through technology, through patient-reported outcome, otherwise. So that continuum is very important. And we've seen the recent publication, and unfortunately, there is transparency where we can learn from each other now. We've seen the publication from FDA's rejection of the Verily application for using a smartwatch in the context of Parkinson's disease for some disease-related measurements. The simple reason for the rejection was that it was not clear how the measurements related to what patients care about, which goes to exactly this definition. What is meaningful to patients? What's the concept you want to measure? And then how do you go about selecting your technology for that specific measurement in that specific context related to disease? So if you don't organize yourself along these lines, you run the risk of the regulators not accepting your results, and then you are left with a failed trial. So it's not rocket science, but it requires diligence, it requires structure, and it requires early engagement with the different stakeholder groups to validate your thinking and not find out too late that perhaps there's a flaw in your setup.
Thanks, Bert. And so I want to make this tool available to the audience, and I'll try to figure out how to do that. But just a great tool. A lot of you are talking about how do I get started and et cetera. Shamay, I want to come to you, and I said I was going to ask you about BYOD, but I'm going to change it up just a little bit. I think having been around the patients and especially been involved in clinical like you have, I think you probably have experienced maybe some of the roadblocks that are in that, and sort of you've seen the opportunity for technology to transcend some of those roadblocks. One of the tools that you shared in our kind of preparing for this session was the pre-mortem key findings that we had. And so I'm going to share that in just a second. But I love your thoughts both on, hey, if I'm at a sponsor company and I'm really concerned about how do I do this, and is this going to cause me problems in my trial? Am I introducing problems I shouldn't have? What do you do to overcome that? And then if you want to flavor that with the idea of BYOD and explain to the audience what we're talking about there and how that might play a factor in that, do so. And I'll share this tool here. And by the way, all these handouts are over on the right under the handouts, and I'm looking at the pre-mortem tool here.
Sure, thanks, Jeremy. There was a lot in that question, so I'm going to try to unpack it. I think there was a couple of topics. So I guess in regards to the first one, for how do you kind of reduce barriers? One of the things that, and it comes up in the pre-mortem that you just described, that came from the Digital Medicine Society, where we were looking at examining all the potential barriers to potentially using a digital endpoint. And one of the key, I think, findings that came up over and over again is the idea of preparation and giving yourself enough time to plan. And I think planning is always very, very key to many things. The better you plan and have contingencies potentially within your plan, the probably the more likelihood of success. And so building in the time for that success is something that maybe traditionally we've not always seen, although I think we're moving towards that paradigm now that digital has become more, there's more experts now, just looking at this panel internally within organizations, you have people who have expertise in this area to say, this is how we should do things. And you can consult the experts either in your organization, or there's other companies out there that can offer that, if it's not within your own company, that can really point to these, to the list of essential items that you may not want to forget about, or you may not have thought about that might be essential to achieving success. And everything from the operations piece that you heard earlier about, when you do global, how do you ensure that devices are reaching your sites? How do you take the data back from these devices? Data management and data sharing are huge pieces that can take entire, days probably worth of discussion in of themselves, but to be aware of those, and for different countries, different devices and device classifications, those can all, really change how you want to structure, your study. So I think all those, pieces, I think of that, if you go to the third column, it's really about, the planning ahead. And sometimes it's, getting the patient feedback beforehand when you're designing, but then going back to the patient, it's not just a one-time visit, but going back to the patient, having them look at the protocol. And then when you run the study, if you can, you have the luxury of doing it at a smaller scale first. That can be very helpful before you say, I'm going to be doing this, throwing this piece of technology in that I've never worked with before, that I don't have an experience with. And, hopefully you're engaging with a vendor that has experience and expertise in this area as well. But all of these, if you can plan it earlier and develop it in your clinical development plan and mature it through the life cycle of your product, and even beyond then, thinking and planning ahead, even if you're developing a clinical trial endpoint and you're using a tool as an endpoint, there are possibly greater applications for it later on in a phase 4 study for monitoring, and then even potentially with the clinical encounter between the healthcare provider and the patient later on that might accompany your product as well. So that might, all of that, should be discussed ahead of time and planned ahead of time, kind of in this, we call it digital development plan that can go in, alongside with clinical development, really integrating that piece will probably ensure the greatest likelihood of success at implementation with the endpoint, but also potentially long-term durability and the greatest utility for, everyone involved, both the clinical trial process, but providers and patients as well. I think that was piece one.
Yeah, that's piece one. And so that's good. You did a great job. So let me just, on the resource, I'm showing it here on the screen, and just to kind of tell folks a little bit about how this worked. This is a Dime Society effort that happened, right? You want to give a little background and maybe tell them how this tool works on the right here?
Sure. So this was one of the work streams that came through the development of what is called the playbook from the Digital Medicine Society, which is really targeted towards really a standardization of terminology and knowledge, and introducing this concept to people across different fields, be it public health, be it clinical development, be it regulators, study coordinators, practicing physicians, all those, groups were kind of thought about. And, it's a huge piece of work. There's narrowing, each piece, there's some tailored information that is specialty specific to say, if this is what you work on, this may be a place to focus on first in terms of getting the knowledge and getting the introduction to some of this material. And as part of that effort, a group of people mainly in drug development had come together to talk about, what are the challenges to digital implementation? And how can we kind of divide this up by the most important concepts and topics? And then how do we rate the risk of this happening, and how do we mitigate the risk? So that's what we did in it's called a premortem, in that it was developed very similarly to how an M&M, is discussed in terms of taking apart all the pieces that went wrong from a systems level, from an individual level, and really analyzing that in many ways to help prevent it from happening again. And in this exercise, it was thought, well, why don't we just do that before it were to happen? Outline, a roadmap to what you should be thinking about, and also just putting the risks, as people rated the risks, really seeing what is the risk of this actually happening, which I think is also a very helpful piece here, looking at the board.
I really enjoyed this work. I was part of this project too. What's neat about it is, for the folks that are on the call today, I just want to sort of exhort you and encourage you, look at these tools because they're helpful, right? I mean, if you're thinking, what's the worst thing that can happen? Well, we thought about it, and that's a unique perspective. I think we get in these conversations often, and we talk a lot about the challenges, and we talk a lot about, what's the benefits, which we've done today, but on the side of understanding the risk aversion in the industry, I think this approach is really a good one, and it's a great tool to sort of reflect on. Okay, well, if I'm going to plan ahead, what am I forgetting, and what's what can happen and what can go wrong, and so we're getting kind of close to the 10 minutes out. I want to leave time for discussion and questions from the audience, but kind of fast forwarding down our list here for the team on the panel. One topic that we spoke quite a bit about, and it's really emerging fast, is decentralized trials. And this concept that DCT is really going to accelerate and is going to put us in a place where we're able to do things more effectively. Lewis, I hadn't heard from you in a minute. Maybe your perspective on DCT at GSK, and I think we all think some of us think it's the silver bullet. Others of us are thinking, man, we haven't even got these problems figured out yet. What's your perspective on decentralized trials, and maybe what are some of the benefits of it, but also some of the things that scare you a little bit?
So that's a very good question. Thanks, Jeremy. I think my perspective of digital clinical trials or decentralized clinical trials, I think is probably not too different from sort of many people in the audience, which is they offer a great opportunity to sort of make clinical trials more efficient, easier to run, better for the patients, and collect data that is more meaningful for the patients as well. Of course, with all the sort of benefits or the potential benefits that the DCT or decentralized clinical trials bring, I think obviously they come with a number of challenges that we need to overcome. And many challenges, I think we could kill possibly the next 10 minutes talking about challenges. Very briefly say, I think in summary, I'll say it is very difficult to change the sort of current status quo, because industry has been working in a particular way for a very long time, and sometimes it is difficult to change the way that we work. But certainly, I think COVID has accelerated, has made us all realize that this is more important than ever. I think we are heading towards an unpredictable future from a clinical trial perspective, many other areas as well, obviously, and clinical decentralized trials will become ever more important for us over the next few years.
Great, thank you. And so, Bert, question here around as we get into this, so many different groups have interest in both helping here and profiting on this opportunity. And then on the sponsor side, a deep interest in developing treatments, in a more rapid fashion and more efficient fashion. Can you talk just a minute about what DEEP does and why that approach that DEEP has is an important one as we get into this new world of DCT and digital IoT?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, for asking. So DEEP stands for Digital Endpoints, Ecosystem, and Protocols. And it's really a framework to bring standardization into this field. On the services side, we would like services to become standardized, services to do with using these digital measures. So you don't have to think about how do I develop a digital measure myself, which would be very soon a redundant activity across all these different sponsor companies finding out for themselves. It would be much easier for service providers to deliver against agreed upon protocols, so you know that they can do it for you, and what you will get will be acceptable by the different stakeholders. On the measurement side, I explained this concept of meaningful aspect of health, concept of interest, technology, and then there's evidence against all of that. That's where we need harmonization. We should not, as sponsor companies, we should not compete on measures. There should not be a choice. Do you measure heart rate the GSK way, or the Janssen way, or the Pfizer way? That would be ridiculous. and it would be impossible to understand for clinicians, let alone regulators. So we need to harmonize on these definitions so we can unite ourselves around the patient, measure the same way what matters for patients, so we can develop products where we do compete that benefit patients most, and we can compare these products based on agreed upon measures. What DEEP intends to do is bring that knowledge together so all these different components can be accessed in a very easy way. So when you want to know what measure is already available for a certain type of patient, that's where you would find it. When you want to make your interest known to develop a new measure, you can find other people who may be interested in the same thing. So you can work together. You can collaborate on the development. When you want to find a service provider for some of that work because you don't want to do it yourself or you can't do it yourself, that's where you would find the marketplace to find these service providers. So it's really a way to improve the ecosystem, to make it easier to use these digital measures and to accelerate the adoption of these digital measures as a result. So we can move away from the experience both Jeremy and Louis you described, where each trial is different. We need to get to a situation where not every trial is unique and different, but there are going to be some repeated patterns whilst developing new measures where there will be differences. That is a sign of maturity that is right in front of us. And very soon we'll be able to see, I've replicated some successful setups. And in the meantime, I've looked for some new ones where there were still gaps in measurement options.
Yeah. Bert, I want to point out the importance of that harmonization from a vendor perspective, if I could. I think a lot of times we look at this, how do we put technology into clinical trials and make them better? And I think the perspective is often is what can we do to serve the sponsor? And so I just want to point, there are a lot of efforts right now that are actually sort of in the middle around not just the sponsor perspective, but the vendor perspective, right? So from our perspective, it's helpful if we can get agreement on what does raw data look like, or, what are the measurements that are coming off the device at the fundamental level? What are the verification requirements? Those are helpful. And then also on the back end, when we deliver data, one of the problems we run into often, and I've spoke pretty boldly about this in several conferences, is getting the data to the sponsor. Every sponsor has a different requirement for what they expect that data to look like. And it's not episodic data. It's not in-clinic data. It's not EDC or ECOA data. This is large amounts of data in which I'm measuring the patients, as I said, their environment and their behavior and their movement continuously 24 hours a day. So it's a bulk amount of data. So we'll often get this question, well, hey, on our data transfer, we'd like you to do that monthly. We'd like it in an Excel format. And those are great points if you're sending over, some survey question information. But when you're sending over data that could approach, gigabytes per patient pretty quickly, that's a challenge. And so there's an importance here that the sponsors and pharma perspective doesn't just squash vendors, right? We've got to consider what does the vendor need in order to accelerate, because that's actually going to benefit the drug development pathway in and of itself. So I see Mark has rejoined us here. Am I out of time, Mark?
That's just to let you know that there's 5 minutes to go until the end of the session. So I guess I'll jump in now. I've been dropping messages in the discuss section. So please do, if anybody has any specific questions for the panel. We've only got 4 minutes left, so I would suggest that you drop them in there, and we can point them to the relevant people.
I guess while we're waiting, maybe one last thought-provoking question I'll ask here is, are there any lessons learned that we can take from the industry, and I'll kind of open that up to the panel. There are a lot of things that are happening that are sort of, indicative and that we can all learn from. Are there any things that you guys would want to share that comes to mind? I've got some. I'm thinking about, FDA is constantly publishing their new thoughts on things, right? That's indicative of the fact that they are listening and they're engaged, as is evidenced by the existence of the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, which is a collaborative effort, and Transcelerate, which, Louis, you're a big part of that. So there's some good things that are kind of pointing us to what's happening there. The DEEP initiative, just different efforts like that are there for us to sort of learn from and watch and listen to the industry.
Maybe quickly, Jeremy, two things: the willingness to collaborate across industry, between vendors and sponsor companies. That willingness is one to seize upon, because it's necessary, and that's the second learning, the need to harmonize on definitions, as we've explained a couple of times. That willingness to collaborate and the need to harmonize, I think, is very fertile ground for further development of these measures, to see the real adoption, and hopefully in an accelerated fashion.
Yes.
Very, very quickly, Jeremy, I'll say I think there are sort of opportunities to learn from also specific successful and unsuccessful uses of technology in our studies. And I think we've got information available in the public domain about both cases. We've got, at the very least, a couple of digital endpoints that they are accepted by the different regulators in different diseases. And again, there is a body of evidence around how the different sort of sponsors went about sort of collecting that evidence. And there is a lot to learn for all of us from that, as well as from the unsuccessful cases, of course.
Yes.
There's going to be still a big evolution. We don't have a lot of time to talk about it in terms of the regulations, that we've seen. Some of it was lifted during the pandemic to ease people's access to healthcare. And a lot of those restrictions are about to kind of be replaced, and some conversation needs to occur about, well, it kind of worked for us well. Why are we now going back to the pre-model, in terms of people being able to access healthcare providers across state and, maybe potentially even country lines. So a lot of these laws and regulations, I think we're looking for, future guidance as terms of, can we be safe and well regulated, but also be adaptable to the changing world.
Agreed. Mark, I think that takes us to the end of our time, sir.
Absolutely, perfectly timed session. So, yeah, we'll close it off there. So, I hope everyone found the session interesting, and hopefully you all gained some good knowledge and can take some useful tips back to the office. So, thank you to everyone for joining us. Special thanks to Lewis, Bert, Jume for sharing their insights, and of course, Jeremy, you've done a fantastic job of moderating the session, keeping it going and getting people to share their insights. And as I say, perfectly timed. So couldn't ask for a better moderator.
Thank you, Mark.
So thank you once again to everybody. And we'll close this session off and we'll see you shortly for the next session.